All right, welcome back to another episode of Finding Peaks. Excited to be with you all today. Thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate you guys following along, giving us feedback along the way for what to speak about on an ongoing basis. And I'm just feeling filled with energy today.
And caffeine.
Yeah,
and caffeine.
Yeah.
Nearly finished my my Starbucks Americano here, so we're rocking hard here. In any case, we were in our office yesterday afternoon having a chat like we do, and in the process, we got into a little snafu about trauma and how it works and what's the best approach to trauma. And trauma is a hot topic in this industry. There's many opinions about it in regards to addiction and how it resolves internal issues. Maybe that's causing an intensity in somebody's life. In that regard, and I kind of just wanted to recreate that matchup you guys got into yesterday.
Well, good news, it hasn't resolved yet.
And it's not
Yeah.
resolved,
Yeah.
so I'm hopeful we'll
I don't
experience
know if it
wide
ever
open.
will, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth talking about. So we'll just do a little round one here.
All right.
Go.
Wow, you didn't even introduce us this time.
Oh gosh, I forgot.
Seriously.
This is my friend Jason Friesma,
Friend.
Chief Clinical Officer, Peaks Recovery.
Right.
Chief Clinical Officer.
Chief Operations.
Yeah, gosh,
Chief Operating
man.
Officer. Wow. Now I'm not even his friend or his
Or the
I'm
right
fired.
operating officer.
Yeah.
I'm fired. Yeah,
Brandon.
I couldn't. They're already cutting. They're already
Brandon said I only have to pick up his dry cleaning 2 more times and I can be his friend. So
Well,
I'm
you
on
got
my
off
way.
easy.
Yeah, I'm on
Okay.
my way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good cleanup there.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great.
A little bit of filler too, right? We were talking about the track experience, and I think several episodes ago about people are doing shot put, the 100-meter dash, the 2-mile around the track. There's different starting points for this, and from your guys' feud, Tench's feud yesterday, it sounds like there's different starting points for trauma work, and 2 seemingly different perspectives in that regard. So again, round 1, go.
Okay. Start us off, Mr. Friesman.
Feelers
Okay.
first.
Yeah, feelers.
I mean,
first.
I guess I propose that trauma is a stuck emotion, and it tends to be we carry it around. I'm a fan of The Body Keeps the Score book talking about how we store trauma in our body, and that we are bound to have triggers or fall back into experiencing our trauma through, a lot of times through our body or through simply shrinking our lives down in a way to avoid triggers. And in my mind, when I look at walking through trauma, like there is certainly a stabilization that needs to happen in the moment through mindfulness or through some skill building and resource development. And that can be like an EMDR type safe place, or just learning how to do grounding and some distress tolerance in the now as an opportunity to then access using those resources to then kind of process and work through past trauma. And then Clinton has a counterpoint.
Like you scratched the surface on your perspective, but that's all right. So,
Yeah.
yeah, you didn't really go all the way down.
It's an introductory, like
It really
it's
is.
a broad
So-
question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, so round 1, right? So I actually don't disagree with a lot of what Jason said. I do think that trauma is something that is stored in the body and is something that we carry around with us. I think that it is something that there's a level of sort of permanence, or at least an imprint of that can be somewhat permanent if it's not addressed. I guess I go more into the brain at that point, though, and start to focus on the trauma health. When we experience trauma, we start to develop neural pathways that help us to avoid the experience, recreating that experience, right? So we start to it becomes a process of avoiding. It becomes a process which can lead to some really maladaptive behaviors, like Jason was saying, where we're actually trying to shrink our lives down so we don't experience these triggers, or we actually are unable to really access certain emotions because of these neural pathways, the way that they developed. And so for me, again, I take just a bit more of a mindfulness approach, like Jason started to talk about, as far as like skill building and being able to ground in the now. And my personal approach to trauma is one that is much more present focused. That is about how you're experiencing your trauma in the present moment, rather than going back and sort of excavating what has happened. It's about identifying how your trauma continues to live on, and then in the moment working through it, rather than falling backwards. So,
in my experience, I have a trauma in my history, and certainly in my more youthful life. But going through, I did a trauma intensive at a fairly infamous program here in the country over a 5-day period, and it was sort of a going back experience. And for me, it was really drawing forward an awareness of the situation and bringing to light what actually happened to me that, differently from my brothers in those settings and so forth. And so I think there is a power to going back in a way and creating that awareness and that foundation of understanding. And I'm just a little bit more curious about, kind of that process, through your lens and the importance of doing that from the clinical perspective.
When I mean, being familiar with your process a bit, Brandon, but like, I do think it's important. I appreciate the here and now piece, and like we did debate pretty heartily, though I think it is more of a Venn diagram. We were just kind of arguing our margins a little bit. But I do really think that like we can't, in my opinion, like it's hard to change things that we're not really conscious or aware of. And so I do think there's a piece of trauma, whether it's people dissociating or choosing not to remember or being unable to bring up memories or that sort of thing, where I think trauma can still be effective without ever becoming conscious. So I think it can also be difficult in the here and now to work on things that haven't been brought at least forward to some degree in the consciousness. Now, I'm not an advocate either for taking 3 years and sitting on a couch like this, for 2 or 3 hours a week and just hashing out every detail of a trauma. Like, I don't think that is helpful at all. Like, I think there are a lot more innovative modalities and approaches to addressing trauma where you don't necessarily have to verbally excavate your trauma, if you will. But I do think in a lot of ways, to me, it's about learning strategies for how to introspect or acknowledging, like, okay, I'm noticing this. I'm noticing I'm irritable. I'm noticing I'm shrinking my world. I'm pushing my support group away. I'm just making my life simpler, and that might mean that something is happening inside of me that I can't quite put a finger on. And so to me, that is the value also in looking back and developing strategies for looking back to say, okay, this is likely how this is showing up in the moment.
Well, what you described is actually identifying trauma in the present, though. I mean, that's really what you're describing. Like, because I'm doing all of these things, I'm sort of expressing all of these behaviors or making all of these choices which feel maladaptive in my world, right? Which are actually affecting me negatively. There's that moment of why, right? Like, why am I? Which is
now you're taking my word.
We're in,
a little bit.
And for the viewers, we're in round 2 at
Right.
this point,
Yeah.
for sure.
You're right.
Okay.
So I guess, and why I think is an important component. Like, why am I doing the things that I'm doing? I think once you realize, though, that there is a reason that I'm doing this, you don't necessarily have to go all the way back and work through that reason. You can actually strategize how to change that behavior. And in the process of mindfully, in the present moment, changing and really addressing the behavior and the emotions that come up when you're experiencing it, you can work through that trauma in the present moment without actually having to excavate or go backwards. Yeah. Did you like that?
I did. You
Yeah,
slammed your
so-
foot down, so
Yeah.
that's authoritative.
Good thing I was
and-
wearing
and,
loafers, because that would have been really loud.
Yeah, it would have been if it was a cowboy boot day. I don't fully disagree with what you're saying either.
Yeah.
Like, I don't disagree with a lot of what you're saying. And in some ways, you're saying what I'm saying as well,
Yeah.
that like these things are the past coming and knocking on
Right.
the present's door, if you will. And like, but to me, there is some value in looking back. Because like sometimes the maladaptive behaviors are almost seem way out of context for what had happened, or the lack of awareness for the process to get to the point where this happened in my childhood, and now I can't say these words to my wife. Like that, there's such a long, circuitous journey to get there. And do you need to take every step along the way? Maybe not, probably not.
Right.
But is there like, okay, in the moment I'm feeling this, I'm feeling something in my body, I'm feeling heat, or I'm feeling
Right.
black, or I'm feeling like I can't look somebody in the eyes because of whatever's happened in the past. Like I hear that those are present related things, but I think there's a value to kind of hold those two things in tension
Right.
and in balance. Because like it won't do any good to go excavate. It doesn't change the moment, of course. Like that's absolutely the goal, is like, to move forward and not have those triggers. But I think the only spot where we differ maybe is how much value there is in exploring some of those past things.
And of course, I think that there is value in getting down to the why, like really, which is kind of where, your approach lands, is in this sort of, you end up in this thing of like, do we focus on the why or do we focus on the what?
What and
right?
how.
And
Yeah.
so he's a why guy, I'm a what guy / how guy. And, it's
Round
just-
3.
Right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
How many rounds is it?
And I do believe that there is value in bringing, to a certain degree, unconscious behaviors to a conscious level, because that way you can work on them very directly. I just don't necessarily believe that it's an absolute necessity. I think that there is value to that in certain moments and in certain cases and with certain clients. I just don't know if it's actually something that has to happen. Because when doing that, all you're actually doing, in my perspective, is reinforcing that synapse connection, right? You're reforming and actually sort of strengthening that synapse processing, rather than breaking it and creating a new one. Science.
I mean,
My
and I
interpretation of
recognize
science,
that
yeah.
that feels like a mic drop moment for you, but like I just don't.
Yeah, I'm gonna get so much
But pick it
clap
up.
back on. Yeah.
Pick it up
People are
the
gonna
floor.
tear me apart on Facebook. It's gonna be great. So
And I guess to me, because you are right. Like, okay, so I mean, if we're going to get into the weeds a little bit about it, like trauma usually does create really pretty negative self-thoughts, right? Like we could probably track it down to, any sort of I am statement that's horrible. Like I oftentimes in group, when I begin to talk about shame or something like that, I literally will sit in a group with 10 guys and be like, who in here, raise your hand if you think you're the worst person on the planet. And every time 5 or 6 hands goes up. And I'm like, so 5 or 6 of you, of the billions of people on the planet, think you're the worst. Like, think about that. That means billions of people think they're the worst person on the planet. And a lot of times that has its origins in some sort of trauma, or where that was reinforced. And like, I guess I just don't know that exploring backward and then learning how to unweave and find new messaging for oneself, or learning how to break the behavior to challenge the shame message, I don't know how that's reinforcing that synaptic part.
right. Well, it made a lot of sense in my head.
I mean, it
So-
sounded great.
I thought
and
it
It
sounded
sounded
awesome.
really good. Yeah,
You
it
just
wasn't-
dropped the mic,
Yeah,
and
I mean,
I-
that could very well not be science. So I don't,
Yeah, but
I don't claim
it is
to be a
because you
master
said
of
it is.
anything. So, but it is. There is actually.
Join us next week when we find out the Earth is flat.
Right. Right.
Well, I think it's
Earth revolves around the
I do think it's
sun. Oh, it
important
does.
to be creative and think about what it's doing as a brain mechanism, because strangely enough, we're operating within the brain nearly the entire time, and in a lot of ways, especially in relationship to addiction. But our industry, and for a variety of different reasons, is one of the few medical side of things where we're not going to crack open the head and look exactly what's going on there.
Yeah.
And so I think being able to bridge gaps in the absence of that real scientific information, it creates great conversation, and felt like a great mic drop moment. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, you guys are going to put that in your book. You were talking about
Yeah.
a book
The
earlier.
mic
Oh,
drop.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I I like the idea of the Venn diagram, right, where we are kind of arguing our margins and sort
Yeah.
of, because there is crossover without a doubt, and I would say probably my perspective is not the most popular or the most common. I think that there is a lot more evidence out there for this sort of excavation process, because that's kind of where trauma has come from, and it has actually moved closer and closer and closer to the moment as time has progressed. I mean, back in the day, there were trauma approaches where you were literally like reliving your trauma and re-traumatizing clients, and so we've moved away from that, I think very rightfully so. I think that I guess my perspective is when somebody realizes that they realize that they're the worst person in the world, right? And what do you do with that, right? Like, so and then you figure out why, because you had a traumatic experience as a child, like this is why you feel that way. So then what do you do with it? What happens then? How do you utilize that information into to transformative change, which is what counseling and therapy is all about. It's all about change.
Yeah.
Right, and I can't tell if you're asking a question or like, are you
Yeah.
making a point?
Did my voice not go up at the end? Yeah.
I mean, kind of, although it could appear rhetorical as well, but like I do
I
think,
think it's both. Yeah.
from my perspective, there is value in fostering empathy for oneself.
Sure.
Because a lot of times I'm the worst person on the planet because when I was 4, I didn't defend myself against my dad, whatever that might be. And like we take our adult perspective and expect the little kid version of ourselves to have done or behave differently is what I've found.
Sure.
And so fostering some empathy for that past part of myself is a valuable part of doing the cognitive and behavioral part of the process.
And I think that that's where I would pick up the baton, right? So you've got the empathy, you've got the awareness, you've got the empathy. So now how do I actually change? Now how do I make this information transformative and meaningful in my life? In what ways am I actually living out this idea that I am the worst person in the world? And how do I directly address those and change those, both on a behavioral level, on a synaptic level, on an emotional level? I think the process does begin to resolve. You start to find resolution through actual change. And so I think that that's where we bridge in that moment. Because I do think that it's, we really are like, I'd mentioned when we've had this conversation multiple times, we're two sides of the same coin to a certain degree. I think it's just a matter of approach and what we choose to focus on.
Yeah, and in our own biases probably
Sure.
in how we're wired.
Right.
And then probably our own experiences along the way as well that
Absolutely.
have informed us what's beneficial to ourselves personally and what's not.
Making it about feelings. Look at
We're
this.
missing
That wasn't even close to a feeling.
Yeah,
it was,
it was pretty close.
maybe approaching a feeling. Like,
Yeah.
don't
Feeling
worry,
adjacent. Yeah.
no tears.
Yeah.
We'll be fine.
If you don't experience it from the viewer side of things, I think in the Venn diagram sort of way, they're actually hugging now. It's no longer a fight. This is a coming together
Fight
moment.
is over.
But I want to exit this episode on two important things here that I think are coming up for me. Namely that trauma is a stuck in time thing. It's an event that happened, whether it was physical, emotional, intellectual abuse. It's an event. It's what is the experience though of trauma when I feel like I'm the worst person in the world? It sounds like shame is the word that I just want to get in here. That's actually the experience of trauma. Absolutely. Is shame, that I no longer have value or I lack value resulting from this stuck in time experience. And just want to make sure that's accurate from my non-clinical lens in reading of this.
I think that's a good read.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that, and if, I think again, another place where Jason and I would really overlap is the idea that in the end, you're working on shame. When you're working on trauma, you're working on shame. And I think that, part of the curriculum that we've developed is based around that. It's this idea that, we don't have a trauma week, but we have a grief and we have a shame week, right? Where we're really exploring that. And again, they do some deep diving in the beginning with Jason, and then on the end, they sort of ground themselves and focus more on the what and the how. And so I think But you hit the nail on the head. In the end, it's shame.
Yeah.
I read Brene Brown, so
Yeah.
it's,
Yes.
it comes up from
She's
time to
pretty
time.
I
influential.
have
Yeah.
Netflix.
Yeah.
And I have Netflix.
I've watched YouTube.
Some
so,
TED
yeah.
Talks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any going out thoughts for you guys, or?
To be clear, I'm quite fond of these discussions.
Absolutely.
And I find them to be very valuable,
Yeah.
honestly.
And we're always kind of hugging. So
Yeah.
yeah,
and-
we're always, it's always
Yeah.
a warm, gushy feeling here somewhere. So,
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
No.
Curious where that goes inevitably, but we'll stop. We'll full stop it
yeah.
here. I just want to thank everybody again for joining us today. Check us out on what do the kids watching? Spotify.
Spotify.
Listening on the Spotify, the Tube, the YouTube,
Insta.
Yeah.
Gram,
Insta,
is that a thing?
the
Instacart?
Facebook,
Yeah.
Apple Store. I think there's several ways to find this episode or these episodes. Of course, please continue to look for us, follow us. Send us your comments, your feedback. It's so valuable to us to know where to take it from here. And we promise, we've talked about it, I think, 10 times now. We're at episode 10.
Are we?
I don't know.
Yeah.
You're making.
But at least
Yeah,
10
you
times
made
we've
that
talked
up.
about it. We're going to change this dynamic up a little bit moving forward. We just kind of wanted to get a foundation and a feel for this environment that we're in, under the hot lamps and so forth. And so we look forward to changing up a few things, inviting some folks onto the future episodes coming up, and engaging more with the why that Jason is going to bring forward to us next
Yeah.
week. So until next time, thank you.
Absolutely. Bring your Kleenex.
This guy.